This is Battleground PA, a PennLive podcast discussing the issues that matter to Pennsylvanians and documenting the events in the Keystone State and beyond that could shape how you vote in the 2024 elections.
Well, greetings again, everyone. This is Joyce Davis, PennLive's Outreach and Opinion Editor, and this is Battleground PA. And as usual, we have with us Jeffrey Lord, who is hailing in from the Republican side of things. Not that I'm the Democrat side, but Jeffrey is at least bringing that perspective. I'm more here to kind of ask questions and guide the conversation. Welcome, Jeffrey. Good to have you with us again.
Good to be here, as always.
Now, Jeffrey, we have a fascinating topic and a fascinating person who's going to lead, a professor who's going to lead us in that discussion. We're going to talk about what we call this urban, suburban, rural divide or urban-rural divide. And Andrew Bloeser is a professor at Allegheny College. And he is actually a director of a center there that actually looks at these issues. I don't have the exact name of it, but he will tell us about all of that. And he's associate professor of political science. He instructs his kids about American democracy, or his young people, because they're adults, right, that you're doing, and really has delved into some of the more cultural issues associated with our what you might call our polarized nation, our polarized politics. But Andrew, that's enough of me trying to say who you are. Why don't you tell us who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm the director of the Center for Political Participation at Allegheny College. And as Joyce mentioned, one of the things that we do is we are beginning to do more research on American politics and public opinion in American politics. And because Allegheny College is located in Meadville and Crawford County, Pennsylvania, we're in a more rural region of the state. And we have an interest in being a good partner to the region that we're in, understanding what's on people's minds here, what their values are, what they think might be a good direction for things to move in. And so we do have some plans in the works here to start doing more public opinion research and connecting to community partnerships more generally that can try to make things better in the region, being a good partner. And in addition to that, I also teach courses in American politics, including some on public opinion, including some that focus on things related to what we've chosen to call the urban-rural divide. And so I look forward to having a conversation about what's going on between urban and rural areas in America and in Pennsylvania specifically.
Well, very good. I appreciate that. And Jeffrey, I think we all believe that there's just a difference between people who live in rural areas and people who live in urban areas. I mean,
well,
yeah.
Joyce, one of the things that I learned as an adopted Pennsylvanian, we moved to Allentown when I was in high school. And Allentown is, but of course, a pretty urban area. But I got involved pretty quickly, you know me, with the Lehigh County Teenage Republicans.
Yes.
And I learned that there was more to that area than just Allentown. And eventually, over time, I began to be introduced to rural America. The first congressman I worked for was Congressman Bud Schuster, who at the time represented what was known as the 9th District. Its big city was Altoona. And then there was also Bedford down in Bedford County. But wow, it was hugely rural. And he went everywhere, and I would go everywhere with him and some of my colleagues. And then on some occasions, I would go by myself. And Joyce, you will be amused at this picture. Somewhere in there, I learned how to milk a cow.
Oh my goodness. Oh my, well, you're better than me. But let's bring Andy into this because, I'm a city girl. I mean, I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, the most sophisticated city in the universe. and the smallest place I've ever lived is Harrisburg, right? Which is the capital. So Andy, here's what I think, based on my ignorance, that people in urban areas are simply more open-minded, more culturally, and people in rural areas are a little more, like maybe family-oriented and closer. So tell me where I'm wrong, because I know I am.
So
that's good.
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities, actually, I think, among Americans, regardless of whether they live in cities, suburbs, rural areas. There's, I think, a pretty common desire to want to be recognized for what one contributes to their society, what one contributes as an American. They want to be living in a nation where they feel respected and valued. And that, I think, tends to be true among people no matter where they happen to live. And there are also, I think, there are people who have prejudices of various sorts who live in all sorts of different places. I don't think that one can generalize to say that the urban
Depending
people
upon
or
location,
the
right?
right, that the urban people, the suburban people are the more cosmopolitan, open-minded ones, and that rural people are somehow backward and closed-minded and parochial. I don't think it works like that. What we know from politics is that when people attach themselves to groups, whatever those groups might be, there's a tendency to think of one's own group as having admirable qualities, and sometimes to think of groups different from one's own that are less familiar than one's own, that one disagrees with, as having less admirable qualities. And we can villainize the other, whoever the other happens to be. And you can see people in urban areas and in rural areas doing that. I think to some degree, this is part of this larger nationalization of politics that we're seeing. We can talk about the localities people live in and whether they're urban or suburban or rural, but a lot of politics has become nationalized around these national party identities, the issues that they stand for, where they situate themselves in the so-called culture wars. And people on different sides of those arguments have some of the same preconceptions, sometimes wrongful preconceptions about the people that they're disagreeing with. But that is a common national problem, more so than it's rural people being closed-minded and urban people being open-minded. There's some open-mindedness and some closed-mindedness, I think, fairly to say, on both sides.
Good point. That's a very good point. Thanks for schooling me on that, correcting old Joyce here. But let me ask you this. Clearly there are differences,
Yeah.
and because that's what you focus in on. And
Mhm.
but I was struck by your saying that people want to be respected, and so that led me to believe: do people live in rural areas, feel that they are not respected and appreciated for their contributions?
Yeah. I think the preponderance of evidence says yes, that's the case. And I think that's been the case for a long time, even before many social scientists and political scientists really began to systematically go out and collect the evidence through surveys and interviews and focus groups and things like that. And so there is, I think, a sense among rural people that they've been forgotten about or left behind or neglected in a couple of different ways. Some of it is about economic grievance. People are concerned about the economic opportunities in areas like their own, in rural areas, just not existing as robustly as what they used to. They're worried about economic opportunities leaving their areas and nothing coming to replace it. And political leaders of both political parties, in some cases, not being sufficiently attentive to that. There's also then cultural concerns, cultural grievances, perhaps, concerns that, echoing your comment before, that there is this narrative out there of the urban people being sophisticated and open-minded, and the rural people being the opposite of that, being closed-minded and things like this, and looked down upon for their way of life and the rhythms of their life, right? The kind of things that rural people find important. And so there are some concerns in rural areas that are distinct, that the people in rural areas think of themselves as being from a particular kind of area. That's certainly about being like kind of out in the countryside where there's lower population density. But more than that, it's about the identity and the values of the people who live in those sorts of places, who understand themselves to be committed to hard work, to self-reliance, to a certain kind of moral traditionalism and family values, perhaps. Sometimes people even say that we're part of rural America in these rural areas, or real America in these rural areas. And there is a sense, I think, that other people have looked down on people in rural areas, and that has created a sense of resentment, I think. Now, rural Americans are not the only ones who are feeling senses of resentment and grievance. You can find those among people in urban areas, for instance, as well. But there are a particular set of resentments and grievances that you find rural people often likely to bring up when they talk about politics, particularly national level politics. And so there are some distinctive concerns there about jobs leaving, about the kids leaving and not coming back because they've gone off to school or to jobs in other places, about what that means for the economy of rural areas, but also what that means for the social fabric of rural areas. And then again, there's also those cultural concerns about being condescended to and looked down upon. And that's real. There are a lot of people in rural areas who feel that way. And that's worth being attentive to as we're trying to figure out what's on people's minds and what bothers them about the state of our nation.
Joyce.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say, Jeffrey, I think your has probably, at least in these last years, a better job of speaking and having a better relationship with people in rural areas. Is that right or wrong? What's the secret there, Joyce?
I didn't hear the very first part of that, Joyce. You froze.
Well, I was going to say in these last years, I'm thinking the Republicans have done a better job of relating to people in rural areas. What's the secret there? What is it?
I think that the Republican Party, a lot of the members, elected members in particular, have learned how to work with rural America. I mentioned the late Congressman Schuster. He was quite the urban guy, educated, etc. What was one of the first things he did when he succeeded in the private sector? He bought a farm in Bedford County in Everett, which I've been to. And suddenly there was Bud Schuster on a horse, and there was Bud Schuster with cows, and the whole 9 yards. And I would suggest that that is not a one-off example. You have people, I mean, look at, for instance, George W. Bush. No more urbanized guy could you find than that. And what does he do when he really starts to succeed? He buys a ranch way out there in the Texas countryside. Not far from us, President Dwight Eisenhower, who was very urban, a military guy. We all know his military career. And then he was president of Columbia University, as I recall the tale. No small urban area that. And he decides that he will make his retirement, and eventually, of course, he ran for president, by buying a farm in Gettysburg.
Well, I think I got to go and buy a farm now. I think you guys are convinced.
Yeah. And we can all do these. We can all do these meetings at your farm.
There you go.
But my point is that this has become quite a cultural thing. And it's gotten more expensive as time goes on. And then there was a third component to all of this. If you weren't urban and you weren't rural, you were up suburban. And that introduced a whole new things. And suburbia, absolutely took over this country in many ways. And you can see, I mean, I'm speaking to you from suburbia this minute, suburban Harrisburg. And so that's a big deal in itself.
That's right. We actually have 3 distinct regions, right? Groups of people. But let's, Andy, really, as you look at it, though, because we are polarized, there are differences. How do you identify where that divide is?
Sure. So first of all, to pick up on one of Jeffrey's points, the Republican Party has done distinctively well in rural areas among people who understand themselves to be rural people. And this has been true really over the past 25 years, especially. We start to see where it used to be urban and rural people roughly equally split in terms of what party they would typically vote for an election after election. But over the last 25 years, you start to see rural people identifying more as conservatives and voting for Republicans in election after election. And actually, some of that story begins even earlier than 25 years ago. You can go back to the 1980s and Ronald Reagan, who began to articulate a vision of conservatism that tapped into some deeply held rural values. I mentioned rural values earlier, like work ethic, right? Hard work. If you work hard, you will achieve and prosper. That this is a land of opportunity and hard work will get you there. That family values will get you there and sustain you. And you see Ronald Reagan talking about an economic vision in terms of individualism and hard work, in terms of his association with the moral majority on some social and cultural issues like abortion. And this resonated in rural areas because it tapped into some values that were already there. And conservatives offered a message of how conservative principles would line up with what were rural values. And that became slowly but steadily through the 90s, then really picking up in the early 2000s and up to the present moment, where rural Americans increasingly identify as conservative and Republican. And some of that's also aesthetics, right? What urban people, right, fancy people might call aesthetics, the way it looks and sounds. George W. Bush was magnificent at this. Donald Trump, in his own way, really resonates because of his manner of speech, because of a certain lack of errors, right? And that looks a little different than what sometimes people consider to be the ordinary politician. It resonates with people in rural areas. And so what's interesting is that rural areas have become more conservative, and that is certainly true. But in some cases, the way that rural conservatives make sense of the world isn't particularly different than conservatives in suburban and urban areas. There are some common values and touchstones there, and the issues that matter to conservatives in urban and suburban areas matter to rural people too, sometimes in some of the same ways. And so what's interesting about rural America is those values are there. The Republican Party has tapped into them. But what's happening in rural areas in terms of values and how that maps onto candidates and issue positions actually isn't so different than what's happening with conservatives in other parts of the country. It's that conservative America has become part of a conservative and Republican electoral coalition in a way that is very distinctive from what it was prior to, say, 25 years ago.
And
Right.
having
Go ahead.
having worked for Ronald Reagan, I can tell you that he had a place in Los Angeles, in suburban
Sure.
Los Angeles, whatever. But of course, he became famous for his ranch,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
as he ascended to the presidency, he really loved the place. It was on top of a mountain, and the staff was less loving of it, because that meant when he went, he was up there with Nancy, and the staff was down in a motel having to make do, which was never a favorite. Oh my God, who got the short straw and has to go to the ranch? But the pictures would come out. We were smart enough to understand the pictures of him chopping wood, building
Yes.
fences, riding horses. If you go to see this Reagan movie that's now out with Dennis Quaid, wow, they sort of got it right on the money.
But I hear you, but I'm just going to say that, I mean, we can't romanticize the rural life. I mean, there is that aspect of wealthy rural life, but then there's the reality that so many people face of not so wealthy rural life that's really hard and grinding, right? I mean, it's a tough existence.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
This is why I think it's somewhere in the American cultural soul, there's so much admiration for rural people, because the understanding is there that the cauliflower that is on their table didn't appear magically overnight. It came from somebody's farm. And somebody out there was working very hard to produce the corn on the cob, the beefsteaks, the chickens, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think that understanding is there.
Talk about that, the poverty, and how that informs basically the politics.
Well, this is why I would say you get into an issue, a political issue, with subsidies for agriculture and the federal government, which has become a whole, when you drive into Washington, and Joyce, I know you know this, you drive over the 14th Street Bridge, and one of the first behemoth buildings that you pass is the United States Department of Agriculture, which was set up, I think I'm correct, in the Lincoln administration a very long time ago. And that was the first sort of federal bureaucracy. So, yeah,
well,
people in government are aware.
Do you find a distrust too of government more in rural areas than in urban areas? Or is there an expectation that government is supposed to help them? Andrew?
So I think what you find in rural areas, because rural areas have become more conservative, you find some of the same issues that conservatives have, with some distrust of government, concerns that government is too involved in life, too involved with regulating businesses, environmental regulations, that we could maybe do with less of that lower taxes are appealing, these sorts of things. But you find that among conservatives even in other areas too. I don't know that rural people may come to that from their own distinctive ways based on the things they've personally experienced in rural America. But there's a broader sort of theme there where rural people are really, I think, just part of this broader conservative coalition, because the Republican Party, through, as we've talked about, some of the symbolism, some of the messaging to rural areas, showing up in rural areas and indicating that there's an understanding of who people are and what they value, that's really resonated. And what's interesting, though, in terms of the government distrust angle, is that if you go back quite a ways in the early part of the 20th century, Franklin Roosevelt was a Democrat who did really well in a lot of rural areas. And of course, the New Deal was government expansion and was addressing issues that were really directly concerning rural Americans. So, support for farms, the electrification of rural areas. A lot of rural people are without electricity. That was a huge improvement to quality of life. If you ask people around that time, is government a source of good? They would have said yes, because Democrats at that time, Roosevelt Democrats, were showing up and making a case for why their approach to governance and public policy could benefit people in rural areas. Now you flash forward to the late 20th century, early 21st century to where we are now, and Democrats have been less involved in making that case. They've kind of forfeited the ground in rural areas for a long period of time. And Republicans are making a case for why a different vision of government would serve rural people better and be more in line with their values. And for Democrats right now, as they're looking at rural Pennsylvanians are like 26% of the state, right? 1 in 4 voters roughly going to the polls here in the presidential election are going to come from rural areas. And right now, Republicans have a pretty strong advantage in those areas, 2-1, 3-1 or more advantage in some of those rural areas. Democrats are aware of this. I mean, this is why Tim Walz, I think, is on the ticket. But
Yeah.
Democrats are going to have a lot of work to do if they want to try to make inroads again and develop credibility with people in rural areas. It didn't happen overnight that we saw this division, this drift toward conservatism in rural areas. The Democrats, have a long way to go, I think, if they're going to try to regain that.
Very good.
One of the
Go ahead.
twist, Joyce, that I think is relatively new in all of this is the rise of the environmental movement.
Mhm.
And now you're starting to see clashes with Democrats that, on the left,
Yes.
saying to this, that, or the other farmer, well, you've disturbed this piece of God's green earth, and we want a federal law to stop you from doing A, B, or C, or making this more agriculture in a farming sense and all of this kind of stuff. And that is becoming an issue in and of itself.
Yeah. And it's interesting on that particular issue on the environment. One of the interesting things is right now there are some divisions along these lines for some of the reasons that Jeffrey has mentioned. In fact, I have a student here who graduated a few years ago. She's from a farm family. They consider themselves to be good stewards of the land. They're really trying hard to do this the right way. And sometimes, the government has come in and said, well, here's a regulation you need to meet, and it's prohibitively expensive for a small family farm to do what it needs to do to deal with a runoff issue that might be at risk of polluting a local stream. And they're like, yeah, this is a problem. We do agree that we want to try to do this in an environmentally sustainable way. We want to be good stewards of the land. That's our ethic. That's our culture. But we can't do what you're asking us to do under these circumstances. And sometimes then on the political left, because of this nationalization of politics, because of this sense of, well, if the other side disagrees with us, there must be something immoral or wrong-headed about that. There's sometimes been a lack of appreciation of what it would mean to meet some of these standards and regulations. And there's sometimes on the left been a tendency to overlook the fact that on the conservative side of the aisle, or among rural people who, now are conservative, but, have not necessarily always been, that there's this ethic of stewardship. There's a lot of really interesting political science scholarship out there right now in rural areas. When you talk to farmers and you talk about environmental protection or sustainability in terms of stewardship, a lot of people are on board. They're like, how can we find common ground on this? And so this is an area where there is perceived to be huge division, and in reality, in some ways there is, but there are also some common ground solutions that could be forged if we had greater political imagination. And I think in some ways, voices coming from rural communities are voices that can help us figure out where that common ground is and how to move forward together. And that shouldn't go overlooked in all this.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Are there coalitions of farmers or of rural people that are forming to kind of magnify their voices and their power? I guess you've made some great points here and of course, we wouldn't be America if we didn't have these rural areas, right?
Yeah.
And I do wonder if they're being depleted, if people are, as you say, kids aren't coming back. So what's going to happen to these areas?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends, I think, on what happens next in terms of public policy responses. And
Yes.
so there is out-migration from rural areas. People are moving away to go to school, to find jobs. And that is certainly on the minds of a lot of rural people. In fact, one of the things that do make rural voters, progressive and conservative rural voters, distinct from other Americans, is that they really express a lot of concern about what's going to happen to their communities. And there's a feeling of, well, no one knows, right? If we look at Crawford County, where I currently live, there's still a lot of tool and die shops jobs around. There's still manufacturing in the region that's a big part of our local economy. But since the 1980s, right, there are fewer of those jobs. There's tool and die shops that have left or have closed down. That is a significant source of concern. It's harder and harder to make it as a small family farm, right? These are real concerns. There's a lot of farm families where the kids aren't picking it up from the parents and the grandparents because they don't believe they can make a living that way. Now, some of those farms get bought up by larger agribusinesses, but there's a real sense of loss then of not just economic loss, but loss of a way of life. And I think one of the concerns coming from rural areas is that, well, who has an answer for my problems on those things? Right. Because I think, one of the things, if we've learned any lessons from the last 2 or 3 waves of presidential politics, is that there's a lot of the turn toward populism in rural areas is that they don't believe that that the traditional leadership of the Democratic or Republican Party has answered those problems. And I think there's still some concern in rural areas that even if one candidate is preferred over the other, there's not necessarily a lot of confidence that there's plans that are going to be put in place. There may be hopes, but I think that there's a lot of unanswered questions right now for people in rural areas about what a better America looks like for them and how people running for high elected office at the national or even at the state level can answer some of those concerns. I think there's a long way to go on those issues.
Absolutely.
One of the things, Joyce, that even if they're not aware that they're being reminded, and exactly, maybe Andy does as well, where I'm talking about, you go into the West Shore Farmers Market and wow, you've got dozens and dozens and dozens of farm stands run by actual farmers selling every last vegetable that you can possibly imagine. And it's a reminder that, we're close to, as a matter of fact, I measured this once out of curiosity. I drove from my house here, that's a block from the West Shore Country Club, and got on Route 15 to see how long it took me to get into the countryside. Well, the answer was something like 10 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. It's very quick.
I mean, physically, we're not always as distant as we imagine. And also in terms of shared concerns, we're not always as distant as we imagine, right? When we talk about issues confronting farmers, who are a big part of rural areas to this day, right? Farmers have concerns, and farmers are people who provide food. People in urban areas, right? There is urban farming, but a lot of that is still coming from rural America. And there's some shared interest there, right? Everyone needs to eat. People in urban and suburban areas need to eat. They should care about the concerns of farmers. Farmers likewise should care about what's happening in urban and suburban areas because they also depend on those people for a livelihood. And one of the unfortunate things about how polarized we've become in America, especially at the national level, is that we sometimes fail to have the political imagination of seeing where there could be some linked fate here across these different regions. And some of that can cut across partisan or ideological lines as well. But right now, we often don't see that kind of political imagination. I think that's one of the challenges going on broadly in American politics right now.
Well,
one of the things Joyce said,
I was just going to say, what I'm hearing, though, is that clearly the Republicans are speaking more respectfully and have that cultural connect. But I'm not hearing that anybody, as you say, really has the economic vision for how we're going to sustain our rural areas and really nurture them, right?
Well,
go ahead.
No, go ahead. It's all right.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, that is certainly my concern. I mean, if we're looking at the median household income in Pennsylvania, it's like, what, $75,000 or something like this. And in rural areas, right, you see it below $55,000 in many rural counties that are predominantly rural and in rural areas across the state. The Pennsylvania Center for Rural Politics, collects statistics on this. And so even though cost of living sometimes can be lower in rural areas, you are seeing incomes that have been behind where they've been at in other places in the state. Now, incomes in urban areas are dropping too. There are concerns there economically in urban areas that require attention too. Most of our conversation here has been on rural politics, I think appropriately, but there are economic concerns in urban areas as well. But in rural areas, household income has lagged behind where it's been in the rest of the state. And there has not, and this has been true for generations, and there hasn't really been a remedy for that that's really stuck and has turned that around. And so that is my concern for places like the place I live, is we need some better public policy solutions and maybe a sharper public policy debate between the two major parties about what could deliver for rural Americans. Yeah. That's my sense anyway.
Well, Joyce, two things. in the long ago, when I worked in the White House political office, we had somebody come in from the Census Bureau to talk population growth around the country and all this. And the guy put up a map of Pennsylvania that had in outline form all the 67 counties, and and they were all white with the black lines, except one county right smack in the middle of the map that was colored orange. Well, I recognized this as Cumberland County. So I raised my hand and said, that's where I live. That's where my parents live. Why is that colored orange? And the answer came that this was the fastest growing county in Pennsylvania at that time. And one of the things that I noticed is in 1976, when I was a child of 4, okay, maybe not, I was I ran for a Republican seat in the legislature. I got endorsed, Joyce, by the Cumberland County Republican Committee and defeated by Hal Mowry,
Oh,
if you
goodness,
remember
okay.
him, who
Yes,
was
yes.
everything I was not. You know, he was 46, he had a marriage, kids, a dog, a mortgage, a business, etc. And I was living at home with mom and dad, you know, interested in politics. But at any rate, when I campaigned, I went up to places in the district like Somerdale and Enola, and they were very small and very tiny and very rural. You go up there now, and that place is just, I mean, there's houses all over the place. There's shopping centers, giant grocery stores, and all this kind of thing. And this is what has happened. And you know, in my own area, I'm told that long before my parents moved in here in 1972, that you go back to 1960, and the developer who has a road named after him now, his name was Howard Gale. I'm told that when he bought this, he was a band leader, and he
Yeah.
bought a celery farm, and he took the celery farm, removed the farm, and started building all these houses. Well,
There you
now,
Yeah.
you know, you've got suburban sprawl all over the place, and it wasn't just particular to here. It was all over central Pennsylvania and that kind of thing, and surely all sorts of other parts of America. So that has become a
Well,
very, very
yeah,
big deal.
absolutely. We have been losing but I will tell you, I mean, even talking to Andy, I came in to say I'm a city girl, but the truth is, I've always envied those people with all of the land around them and the ability to simply walk and ride horses. I mean, what a
Yes.
fascinating, healthy, peaceful way to live. At least that's the romantic vision
I think,
of
Joyce, if I had a horse in the garage, the East Pennsboro officials might contact me.
They certainly might. They certainly might. Well, Andy, I want to thank you very much for joining us and trying to shed a little light on these issues, because they are very complex and they are very easy to let's say get wrong and to misunderstand.
And
So I
Joyce, one quick last thing.
yeah,
This is going to have an effect on this election in a couple
sure,
weeks. I mean,
sure.
all this attention that's being paid to Pennsylvania, what goes on in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and what goes on right here where we live is going to
Yeah,
determine how those 19 Pennsylvania electoral votes go. So it will be
Yeah.
very interesting to see, and that is going to play a big role.
Yeah. And to add on to that point, right, while Republicans have strongholds right now in rural areas, which is what we spent much of our time talking about, the suburbs are also an interesting place to watch in this. Democrats have at least a 2-to-1 advantage in places like Pittsburgh and especially in Philadelphia.
Yes.
Republicans like a 2-to-1 or so advantage in the countryside and rural areas. The suburbs are really interesting, especially in the suburbs around Philadelphia. And if you've been tracking political reporting in the Dispatch, which is a more conservative outlet, in Politico, there's been a lot of attention to what's happening in Bucks County, in relatively affluent suburbs. There's a lot of effort from the Harris campaign to try to make inroads there, because they believe they can make bigger inroads there more immediately than what they can in rural areas. And so what happens in Bucks County and some of those suburbs is going to be really, really important. We've seen actually some voter registrations uptick in some of those areas. The Harris
Right.
campaign is wondering, can it be enough, right, to offset some of the disadvantages they may have, I think, in the rural areas, even as they try to make those inroads? And Tim Walz is part of that strategy. There's an awareness among Democrats that maybe rural voters have been ignored. Maybe Democrats need to start showing up more in rural areas. But 2024 would only be the tip of that spear. If we see more of that from the Democratic Party moving forward, it might make for a more interesting and more perhaps a version of American politics that that might be more beneficial. If we start to see more party competition in these rural areas, but we'll see what happens both in 2024 and beyond.
Keep your eye as well on not just on those Philadelphia suburban counties, but Luzerne County and Erie County. I think there's a real battle going on there between the two parties for those seats, and that's a big deal.
Yeah, Erie County is definitely one to watch. It's going to be a bellwether county for sure.
Absolutely. Well, and the reason we focus so much on rural, because we don't talk enough about the rural voters. I mean, we're always focused on these larger areas. So, and that's what your value was to us. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate being here.
And we may have you again. Let's see how this goes. And thank you again to our readers and our viewers and our listeners for tuning in for Battleground PA. We will see you again next week because we're keeping at this until November 5th. Get out and vote, everybody, or mail it in.
Once.
Mail it in like I did. Okay. Bye-bye, Andy. Thank you so much. Bye, Jeff.
Thank you again.
Bye-bye. Thanks.